And the recording will be available afterwards to everyone who has registered for our commissioner's course. As you notice today, we are actually in a meeting format rather than a webinar. We are going to have 2 short presentations and then go into a breakout session where we're actually going to review a site plan. So if everyone can keep themselves muted during the initial presentations, that would be great. You can put your questions into the chat and we'll try to get to them before we go into the breakout session. Also want to remind you that on April 22nd, N.J.A.C is going to have their 2nd virtual Earth Day celebration where ECs can promote your own work by taking out a booth in our hop-in platform. So we look for upcoming information on that. We'll be going out shortly, so you can join us for that event. This evening, we are going to initially have 2 presentations that I said. I'm doing the first one on the site plan review process. This will be followed by Dr. Chris Abrupta, who will be talking about the new stormwater management rules and how that affects your site plan review. We'll then go into breakout sessions, and we're going to have 4 of them. They're going to be led by Dr. Christopher Abrupta, Jennifer Coffey, Dr. Steve Sousa, and myself, and along with some other N.J.A.C people who will help us with that those breakout sessions. So site plan and subdivision review. If you're with us earlier this afternoon, you have seen this roadmap already. Ideally, you're going to want to start with an environmental resource inventory so that you actually know what your resources are. This inventory should be then utilized, excuse me, sorry, moved too fast, let me go back. This inventory should be utilized in developing your master plan and zoning maps, which then guides the development of the your ordinances for your municipality. So when a developer comes in with a project, they should comply with your master plan and ordinances. And according to the municipal land use law, if an ERI has been submitted to the planning and zoning boards, then those boards should make available to the Environmental Commission a copy of all development applications for ECs to review as part of the application process. Every municipality has to have a site plan ordinance. There are 5 elements that are required, but every municipality is different. So you should, these ordinances vary widely, so you should get a copy of them and see what your ordinance actually has in it. Site plan versus subdivision. A site plan is a development plan for an individual lot or tract, and a subdivision is simply the division of a piece of land into 2 or more lots. Here's an example of a site plan. You can see where there is, or the building is going to actually take place on one particular lot, versus a subdivision plan, which is simply taking a larger lot and splitting it up into smaller subdivisions, smaller lot sizes. So why should an environmental commission review a site plan? Well, you as environmental commissioners are the eyes and ears for the environment. You can look to see what type of impact a particular development might have. Planning board members will not likely have the time or ability to actually pay attention to the environmental impacts and rely on environmental commissioners for their recommendations. You can also help save money by correcting issues associated with poor development, such as uncontrolled stormwater. And you also should look beyond what is actually happening on the particular lot that's being developed, but what the might be impacted outside areas from that development, whereas a planning board members probably won't look to see beyond the development site itself. So why perform a site plan review? Well, you want to prevent something like this from happening. This was in Parsippany. There wasn't appropriate erosion controls in place and got hit with a heavy rainstorm, and basically you have lost all your soil off the site during construction onto the roadway and down the stream. So you want to prevent this from happening, to make sure that things are in place in a site plan to prevent something like this from happening. This is the general review process for a site plan. It starts with a pre-application process where an applicant might come in and talk to members of the township. It might be the economic development director, the mayor, or town manager, a representative from the planning board, but environmental commissioners may not always be invited to this informal meeting. This is why you would really want to become very familiar with who your planning board secretary is, become their friend, so they can inform you when an applicant might be coming in to propose a project, so that you can actually be part of this meeting up front to get involved in looking at what is being proposed and making recommendations at that initial stage. Because then the applicant then puts together their submission to the planning board secretary. It would include environmental impact statements, various checklists, perhaps needs a wetlands delineation, referred to as a letter of interpretation from the New Jersey DEP. As I said, the environmental commissioners really need to be part of this initial two-step process, the pre-application process and the actually working with the application submission. Because once the application is submitted and determined complete, it then goes to the planning board afterwards for preliminary and final approval. But it's very difficult to make changes once the application is determined to be complete, because it takes a lot of money and energy and time for applicants to change things. So if you're involved in the initial phase, it makes it much easier to come up with a much better application and plan that to address environmental concerns. This is just an example from the Princeton website. They actually post their entire application, planning board application. You can see what is involved in an actual application. So it's not just the development plan, but there's also a number of different type of checklists that have to be submitted. There's a traffic impact study, a tree inventory, stormwater management. So it's a very, very intensive process for the applicant to get all this information to the planning board. During your evaluation, you want to look at what the impacts are on site from the development activities such as grading, road building, what impacts there are on resources. There's going to be a loss of wetlands, habitat loss, vegetation. So those are looking at what's happening on site, but you also need to consider what might be happening off site. Is there going to be an increase in flooding? Is there going to be traffic issues? Loss of farmland? Is there going to be an increase in non-point source pollution from the development? These type of things you should consider. But you don't know what the impacts are unless you actually know what is on the site itself now, currently. And this is where your environmental resource inventory comes in place, because all of this information should be included in the mapping of your environmental resource inventory. So that's why it's really important to have one of these so you can actually know what's there and what might be impacted from the development. There are a lot of there are a lot of resources, mapping resources online also that you can refer to. One of the ones I like to look at is the New Jersey Conservation Blueprint Map, and I have a link to it here, which I think Sheila is going to put into the chat also. So you can look, so this is just an example of part of a checklist that the Environmental Commission can put together. This is one part of a checklist that to look at what are the existing conditions so you can determine this. N.J.A.C does have a sample a complete checklist that we can make available to you. Just let us know if your Environmental Commission would like to have us send you that checklist that you can start as a template to develop one for your own commission. So I'm just going to go through a couple of things that you might want to look at when you're looking at these site plans very quickly. So you want to look at where are the steep slopes. Steep slopes are indicated by these contour lines. The closer the contour lines are to each other, the steeper the slope. In this case, 20 out of 90 acres of this particular site is actually considered steep slope, which is anything greater than a 15 degrees slope here. And it, constructing on a steep slope can be, result in pretty devastating results if it's not done properly. If you'll, back in March of 2021, there was a collapse of the retaining wall during the 295 construction, where they're trying to link 295 and 72 to Route 42. Preliminary investigation has shown that the collapse was due to a heavy rainstorm and high groundwater that compromised the subsurface soils. And this project, which was supposed to be complete at the end of 2021, is now not expected to be completed until 2028. So you can imagine the additional costs because of that collapse that occurred, and which could have been averted, if the planning was done properly. Identification of wetlands. The wetlands, wetlands are regulated by the New Jersey DEP. Municipalities can't pass wetland ordinances, but they can ensure that the state regulations are followed. This requires a letter of interpretation from the DEP. When that letter comes in, if there are wetlands, and environmental commissioners might question that, is the delineation correct? You can, ask to have additional survey go out to the site to, confirm that that the mapping of these wetlands is actually correct. So for whenever there's a wetland, there's a wetland boundary. There should be a 50-foot transition area. It is possible in some cases that a development might be encroaching upon that transition area. If that happens, there should be compensation somewhere else on the wetland to make up for that loss of transition area, so that retains the same area. Another piece of the site plan is a landscape plan. This is probably one of the easier parts of the site plan for an environmental commission actually to review. It includes where trees are going to be planted or shrubbery. And in this red box here is the listing of all the trees that are going to be planted. So you want to look at that to determine if those trees are native, are there any invasives, where on the site are they being planted. You don't want to plant a large tree in a small little area that's not going to be able to survive or grow. So these are, there's a lot that goes into site plan review. It can be overwhelming at times, but this is one of the parts of the site plan that might be the easiest place to start for review if your environmental commission is not used to doing a site plan review. So you can start a little at a time and learn as you go along. Sometimes you want to actually go out to the site, because it might be to visit it. It might be important. You can notify the applicant you want to go out and take a look at the site beforehand to see what's there. The applicant should be able to mark the boundaries, where the wetlands are. You want to bring your site plan with you and take, take some photos and take notes, and include this in as your part of your commissioner's report. For the analysis, you want to make sure obviously it's consistent with your master plan, complies with your ordinances, look what the existing constraints are on the site. Does the development site, does it provide for your basic services? And so some of the things that you might want to consider. Chris is now going to talk about the after I'm finished, Chris is going to talk about the stormwater management rules and how the site plan must comply with those new rules. The other thing I wanted to mention right here is that the Department of the DCA came out with rules for electric vehicles installations. These charging stations are now permitted in all zoning districts, and rules have been established based on parking requirements. So, for example, for a multiple dwelling application of 5 or more units, 15% of the required parking spaces must be made EV made ready, which means that you have to have the electric conduit in place so that a charging station can actually be installed. And during the construction, 1/3 of those locations need to actually have charging station installed. And then over the next 6 years, the remaining sites that are EV made ready needs to have charging stations installed. I want to make sure that you really, because this is a new requirement that should be in all site plans. So in the end, you have a finding your facts, you have your recommendations, you put together a report, you present it to the planning board, and you want to be at the public hearing to provide testimony during the planning board review of an application. I also want to, any recommendations that you would want the developer to do, has to be put into the planning board resolutions. Those conditions, if you want something changed, and if those conditions aren't part of the approval and part of the resolution, part of the planning board resolution, then they will not be enforceable. So if you want the developer to change something, you better make sure that that actually gets into the resolution itself. So at that point, I'm going to actually stop sharing my screen. And Chris, you're up. You can start the next session, part of our presentation, and then we will go into breakout sessions.
Can you hear me now? That good?
Yep, we've got you.
Okay.
Thanks, Chris.
No problem. So I'm going to talk about the new stormwater management regulations, and they are relatively new. They were proposed in 2019. They were adopted in March of 2021 during COVID. So just a wonderful time period that we all lived through. The regulations, and these are the stormwater management regulations. So there's two things you need to know. One is these regulations were proposed by the state of New Jersey and adopted by the state of New Jersey, and every municipality has to comply with these regulations. Your town had to come up with a stormwater control ordinance that mimics these regulations and enforces these regulations. And you as a town are required to make sure all developers comply with these regulations, because you do have a permit for your municipal separate storm source system. So every one of the 565 municipalities must enforce these stormwater regulations. If for some reason you don't enforce these regulations, you are in violation of your permit, and you as a town can be fined by New Jersey DEP. Okay, so I think that's really the important thing. My environmental commission, I use it all the time when developers come up and they say, well, I know you want to do that, but that doesn't comply with the regulations. If we don't comply with the regulations, my town can be fined, and I'm unwilling to let that happen. So I'm going to have to say something bad about your development and write it in my letter from the EC to the planning board. The regulations did not change since 2004. Actually, the requirements did not change, but how you comply with the requirements do, right? So we still have to use these kind of non-structural stormwater management strategies. They've kind of replaced that with green infrastructure. We'll talk about that in a minute. You still have to reduce stormwater volumes of peak flows. So for the 2-year, the 10-year, and 100-year storm, you have to have less stormwater flows running off, heavy flows running off from those storms. You have to maintain 100% of your annual average groundwater recharge, and you have to protect the waterways from pollution. So these regulations apply to any major development, which is defined as disturbing more than 1 acre or increasing impervious cover by 1/4 of an acre. Okay, and these are kind of the design performance standards they have in the regulation. There's quantity, recharge, quality. There's maintenance requirements, so you have to have a maintenance plan whatever you build, and you still have to do these kind of non-structural stormwater management strategies, but we do that through the adoption of green infrastructure. So the whole idea with the non-structural strategies was really trying to protect what's already there and building with the land, and not really just raping and pillaging the land like we used to, where we knock everything down and we build from scratch, trying to save trees and trying to save wetlands, trying to minimize impervious cover. So all that is kind of still in the regulations, but really it's really tied to this green infrastructure stuff. So water quantity, we've been doing this since the 1980s. It's basically same requirements. There's 3 options. Most developers use a 3rd option. So they have to manage the peak flow from the 2, the 10, 100-year storm. So what they do is they figure out what is the peak flow that's flowing off the property now. And after I put my development in, what's the peak flow flowing off the property after I develop? And it has to be, for the 2-year, has to be 50% of what it was pre-development. For the 10-year, it has to be 75% or less of the pre-development. For 100 years, it has to be 80% or less of the pre-development. So you're knocking it down by 50%, 25%, and 20%. Below there lists kind of an approximation of what the storms are. This is actually for Somerset County. It's different for every county. The 2-year storm is about 3.3 inches of rain over 24 hours. The 10-year storm is 5 inches of rain, and 100-year storm is 8.3 inches of rain over 24 hours. Hurricane Ida dropped 8.3 inches of rain over 6 hours, which is more like the 2000-year storm. So lot different than what we're talking about here today. Groundwater recharge requirements, you have to maintain 100% of your annual average groundwater recharge. So in other words, if you have a 50-acre site and it was recharging 1 million gallons of stormwater a year, capturing the rainfall and getting 1 million gallons back into the ground, after you put up your townhouses, your mini mall, or whatever you're building, it still has to be putting that same volume of water back into the ground. Okay. Another way to evaluate it is by recharging the difference between the pre and the post development of 2-year storm, which often gives you a higher number. So most people are usually using this first requirement. Okay. And there's a spreadsheet that New Jersey DEP has that you can fill out to make sure you're complying with this. And this is where most developers try to cheat. And we could talk about that later on. Okay. The last performance requirement is water quality. You have to remove 80% of the total suspended solids. This is 80% of the sediment basically that's washing off the land, but it's really only off motor vehicle surfaces. So that's been a new change to the regulations. You still have to install management practices to provide nutrient removal to the maximum extent feasible, which is kind of a lawyer term. I'm not really sure exactly what that is, but they do have a BMP, or Best Management Practice Manual. And that's what BMP stands for, Best Management Practice. And that manual actually will have in it design standards for each of these different practices here. So if you build a bioretention system, which is we also refer to as a rain garden, you will remove 90% of the sediment if you build it the way it's shown in the manual. Okay, so once you follow the manual, you build it that way, you get the 90% credit. Okay. And this is a copy of the manual. You can download this online. You type in New Jersey DP, Stormwater Best Management Practice Manual. It takes you to a website. A lot of great stuff on their website. Okay, so the revisions that came out in 2019, what happened was they had these non-structural stormwater management strategies, and we used to have a spreadsheet, and you would go in and enter stuff in the spreadsheet. You get enough points, and you say, okay, great, I satisfied the requirement. The problem was the spreadsheet was never adopted with the regulations. So somebody took them to court, they threw the spreadsheet out, so you could no longer use it. So there was really no easy way to tell if people were complying with this non-structural stormwater management strategy requirement. So what DEP said, well, why don't we, instead of doing that, why don't we make people use green infrastructure, and that'll be kind of a way around that. Okay. And then the other one is they applied the total suspended solids to motor vehicle surfaces only, whereas before it used to be rooftops and other impervious surfaces, but now it's just for motor vehicle surfaces. So green infrastructure really simply is stormwater management technique, and this is how DEP describes it. What you're trying to do is you're trying to capture water as close to the source as possible. You're treating the water through infiltration into the soil. You're treating the water by filtration of vegetation or soil, or you're storing the water for reuse later. Okay. So we have lots of different practices that kind of comply with this, and we'll talk about a few of those. So what New Jersey DEP has done is they put 3 tables in their regulations. And they say you've got 3 requirements to satisfy. You got the groundwater recharge requirement, you got the water quality requirement, and the water quantity requirement. All 3 of those requirements must be satisfied by using a green infrastructure practice that's shown in table 1 or table 2 of the regulations. If you don't use a green infrastructure practice, you can get a waiver or a variance. You can't get a waiver, you get a variance, but you have to do a mitigation project to make up for that. Okay, so that's really, really important. Okay, so you can't just wave your hand and say, oh, you don't have to do that. Then you're not in compliance with your permit and you could be sued. So this becomes very important. So here's the first table, and you can see here they have all the practices listed on the left-hand side, and they have the water quality requirement, the total suspended solids or TSS removal. And if you look at the first practice, bioretention system, it gets between 80 or 90% TSS removal. So that satisfies the requirement. You could also design it to hold the 2, the 10, 100-year storm and get the quantity requirement, right? And you could also design it so it captures the water and slowly releases the water back into the ground to satisfy your groundwater recharge requirement. Now, if you're using it to satisfy your groundwater recharge requirement, you have to have a minimum of 2 feet beneath the system to the groundwater table. And this is a place where developers try to cheat here also. And 1.5 feet instead of 2 feet. You really need that 2 feet. If you only have 1 foot, you can put an under drain in it, and you can just use it for quantity and quality and not recharge. And you can see, you can go down this list of all the ones they have here. And it's really important that there's drainage area limitations that apply to these. Before, when we developed, we would put houses up and put a big basin at the bottom of the hill, and we collect all the water from that whole development into that basin. Now, the most you can put into these practices are for the quantity, or for the quality and the recharge, are up to 2.5 acres. So now you're going to have much smaller systems scattered throughout the entire development. So this is another place I've seen developers try to cheat. It was they're trying to put 3 or 4 acres into one of these bioretention systems, one of these rain gardens, and that's not allowed. That doesn't satisfy the regulations. Okay, table 2 is really for quantity, okay, purposes, and really has some of these bigger systems in here. The bioretention system does a great job for quantity. Infiltration basins, standard constructed wetlands and wet ponds. So these are systems that may be used only for quantity. Okay, and then table 3 is, okay, these are other systems that you can use if you get a variance. Okay, so that's kind of what's shown in here. Okay, so let's talk about the practicality of this. When we look at this great table, lots of cool stuff in here, but there's only really 4 of these that you can use to satisfy all 3 requirements. Okay, the bioretention system, the infiltration basin, the pervious paving systems, and the sand filters. Pervious paving systems, very simple. It's either porous asphalt, pervious concrete, maybe interlocking pavers, grass pavers, and you have a big stone layer underneath. Water can go through the surface, goes into the stone, and slowly percolates into the ground. And because it's going through that soil, it's getting filtered by the soil and is satisfied as it qualifies as a green infrastructure system. Okay, so these systems work really well. We see a lot of these throughout New Jersey now being built. Great systems, a great way to satisfy stormwater requirements. You can see some pictures of it here, upper right-hand corner. That's the pervious concrete, water passing right through it. You can see a cross section of it. That stone layer under that parking lot can be as thick as you need it to be. That porosity of the stone, or the void space, is about 40%. So for every 2.5 gallons of stone, you can store about a gallon of water. Okay, so that gives you how deep that has to be able to hold enough water to manage the 2, the 10, and 100-year storm. Okay, and here's a project we did in Clark. You can see the actual parking spots are porous asphalt, and the cartway where the cars drive in is regular asphalt, and the water rushes the cartway onto the parking spots and infiltrates into the stone layer underneath, and ultimately into the ground. Grass pavers are another option. So those are the things that we've been looking at. Bioretention is another great system. We often refer to these as rain gardens. The idea is the water kind of goes in here and infiltrates into the ground. There's lots of different types of bioretention systems you can build. They can fit in almost any landscape. That's why developers like using these. They can come in any size, so they can manage up to 2.5 acres if you have to, or much less. Okay. And you can see you can get water from the roadway by putting a little concrete trench under the sidewalk, as shown here in the picture. You could take water from parking lots in this library project. Another system is these infiltration systems. Once again, it's very similar to the original detention basin we had, but the water kind of goes in and soaks into the ground. It has 6 inches of sand in it. Water goes through the sand. The one problem I have with these systems is that sand can clog, so you actually have to mechanically go out there and rake it out every once in a while and loosen it up so it doesn't get that biofilm built up on the surface. You can build these into bigger systems so they can also manage the 2, the 10, 100-year storm, like shown here, but you always need that forebay, which is shown here in the picture, which will catch the water. A lot of stuff will settle out in the forebay before it goes into your infiltration system. So the other system we have, and a sand filter system here. Now you can see here the difference with this is this actually has some soil and grass on top. So it's kind of weird because the infiltration system or infiltration basin has all sand, but the sand filter has sand with grass over top of it. So it's kind of strange terminology they have here. But you can see same kind of system. Water goes in and filters it, goes to the ground, And you can see how we have different ones here. Also can manage the 2, the 10, 100-year storm. So those are the things that we have, and I'm going to stop sharing there. Like I said, I'm on my environmental commission. I see developers come in all the time and try to figure out ways around this. The most recent thing they're trying to do now is we look at soil types. There's 4 soil types, A, B, C, and D. A is obviously the best soil type, just like it would be if you got a grade from one of my exams, right? So it filters water very quickly into the ground, whereas a D soil is very clay and water doesn't go into the ground. There's very little recharge associated with that. So I get a lot of developers coming in and saying, well, I know it says on the map that the soils are type C and we should get groundwater recharge, but we tested them and they're really more like D soils. So there should be no recharge. So we shouldn't have to satisfy the groundwater recharge requirement. Well, that would be true if they were truly D soils, but there's a lot of things you have to do to justify changing a soil type from C to D. And a lot of these guys aren't doing that. I was at a meeting the other day and the guy said, well, we didn't do any infiltration tests, but we looked at the soil and it really looked like it was D. Oh, really? You looked at it? Wait, all by yourself? That's really nice. That's really pretty cool. So, and so a lot of these guys are historic guys where they come in every time I see them, they're telling me the soil is, I know it's classified as C, but it's really a D. And I'm like, okay, you can't do that every single meeting. It's not possible. So those are things that we see a lot of lately. And that's been a big problem. So I'll stop there. Randy, was that okay? I forgot I was supposed to be doing this today, so I just kind of put something
that was
together while
great.
you were talking. So,
Liz, is there any questions we want to take now before going to the breakout session? I really haven't
Absolutely.
watched.
We had a good, Lorraine had asked the question of who does the math to ensure a developer is following the rules? Is that something the municipal engineer would do?
yeah. So the town engineer. So there's one or two things. Your town may have its own engineer, and they would review the development plan and check all those calculations. Sometimes the town will have a private engineer, a consulting engineer who does that for them, and they would do those calculations and they would write a letter to the town, and you as the environmental commission would get that letter. So for example, my town in Hillsborough, Pannoni Engineering does that for us. So before we go into the meeting, we get a letter from Pannoni Engineering reviewing the plans. Here's all the things they found wrong with it. And we actually will ask the developer some questions about how are they addressing those and things like that. Now, because I have knowledge, I actually go through a lot of calculations myself, and I'll ask even harder questions than what Pannoni's going to ask. But so really, you got to rely on your town engineer. So it's important that your town engineer is educated and takes the training courses to be able to do this, because a lot of the old time engineers don't really know much about green infrastructure. So, so you really have to make sure that they've been trained and they know what they're talking about. And Dr. Souza teaches a class at Rutgers, continuing education on green infrastructure. Engineers can take that and get their continuing education credits, get 3 days out of the office, get to see Steve, nice guy, and really learn a lot of stuff. So I think really important to encourage the guys to do that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chris. I think we've covered most of the questions. We're going to go into breakout rooms now. And what's going to happen is it takes a couple of minutes, so just be patient. You'll get a little pop-up saying it's going to move you into a room, and just say okay or yes to that. And then for our speakers, Chris and Steve and everybody, just wait a minute because I have to move you to the correct rooms with your teammate. So just we will see you all soon. When you're finished, you can either come back to the main room and say hello to me again, or you can just leave the Zoom and we will see you all later. Again, room managers, don't forget to record, please.
Yes, and we're trying to wrap up by 8:30, so we may or may not get through the entire process. If we don't, then we will make the site plans available to you with the questions. So if you want to do something in your spare time, you can look at them and answer the questions and see what we're looking at.
That's right.
And I will just add before we all break out into our rooms and we get beamed over like Scotty does on Star Trek. We have some in-depth stormwater analysis seminars on our YouTube channel. So at N.J.A.C Views. So you can go ahead and look there. If you didn't get quite enough stormwater, we've got lots and lots of Chris on YouTube. So you can go ahead over there and take a look and view that at your leisure. So, okay, Scotty, aka Liz, let's beam us into our rooms. Thanks, everybody.
Deanie, you didn't get a thing asking you to move somewhere?
Oh, sorry. It was asking me to move to room 3 and Sheila was already there.
Well, that's okay. I will move you around once you're in a room, but just stay there. I'll move you to a room. Just a minute.
Okay,
I'll
thanks.
gotta find Steve Souza first. Okay, Steve is in, oh, I'm gonna have to move him anyway. All right, Alex is gonna move to,
Yeah, it was asked me to go to room 4 and I ended up with Jen, so I came back to the main room.
okay. Who's going with Steve? You are, Deanie?
Yes.
Okay, so room 3 is the right one.
Okay.
And I'm
So
supposed to be
So
with
now-
Michelle.
Can you get into it or not anymore? I'll move you to 1 and then I'll move you back out. So say yes to 1 and then I'll move you back to 3. Because I can't move you back to 3 when it supposedly thinks you're there.
Yeah,
Okay.
I know I'm supposed to be with Michelle because I ended up with Jen, but I came back to the main room.
Okay, so where's Michelle? You're supposed to be with who?
Michelle,
Okay.
but I ended up, it asked me to go to room 4 and I ended up in Jen's room, so I came back to the main room.
Okay, so let's see, who do we have? Michelle Gaynor. Okay, so you need to go to where? Oh, okay. Let's see, where are you?
I don't know.
Move to 2. Okay, so that does you.
All right, thank you. I'll go to 2. Goodbye.
Okay. Michelle and Randy. Deanie and Sheila. And Steve. Sheila's supposed to be with Jen. Where is Jen? Hi, you're not in a room because when I send you to one, I believe there's a pop-up that comes that you have to say yes or okay to. I can try to move you into a room again if you like. You could answer me in the chat.